Is that supposed to fool this court? Judge Richard Holloway's voice sliced through the quiet courtroom with polished contempt, carrying the confidence of a man who had never expected anyone to challenge his authority. He leaned forward over the dark oak bench, his sharp eyes fixed on the faded ribbons and worn medals resting neatly across the chest of the elderly man standing before him. The fluorescent lights above reflected faintly against the tarnished metal, revealing scratches, dents, and years that no polishing cloth could erase. A few people sitting in the gallery exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether they were witnessing a routine hearing or something that had quietly become far more personal. Martin Callahan, 87 years old, remained perfectly still. His weathered gray suit had clearly belonged to another decade, carefully pressed despite its age, and the brown leather shoes beneath him had been repaired more times than replaced. His silver hair was neatly combed, his shoulders no longer straight enough to hide the weight of time, yet his pale blue eyes never drifted toward the judge. Instead, they rested on the American flag standing silently in the corner of the courtroom, its colors softened beneath the harsh government lighting. The silence surrounding him seemed almost unnatural, as though years of discipline had taught him that not every accusation deserved an answer. Judge Holloway let out a short, humorless laugh before lifting one of the medals with 2 fingers, holding it away from himself as if examining a counterfeit bill. "I've seen better replicas sold at flea markets," he remarked, shaking his head while several nervous chuckles escaped from the back of the courtroom. "People expect sympathy these days. A few fake decorations, a sad story, and suddenly they're heroes." Martin never reached for the medal. He simply watched the judge without anger, without embarrassment, wearing the expression of someone who had long ago learned that dignity could survive insults that pride never could. His court-appointed attorney shifted uneasily beside him, opening his mouth as though preparing to object before thinking better of it. Every attempt to interrupt Judge Holloway during the hearing had only made the judge more impatient. The courtroom clerk stared down at her paperwork, pretending not to hear the growing discomfort spreading through the room. Near the prosecution table, Assistant District Attorney Ethan Brooks studied the old veteran with quiet curiosity. Something about the way the medals had been mounted caught his attention. They were not arranged for display or decoration. They sat with precise military spacing, every ribbon aligned despite decades of wear. His father, a retired Army colonel, had once spent an entire afternoon teaching him why veterans never misplaced medals they had truly earned. Ethan remembered every word. The judge carelessly flipped one ribbon over with his finger, causing the medal to swing gently before settling against Martin's chest once more. "Tell me, Mr. Callahan," Holloway continued, his smile growing colder, "did you buy these all at once, or did you collect them one fake story at a time?" The question lingered in the still air, cruel enough to silence even those who had quietly enjoyed the spectacle only moments earlier. Martin slowly lowered his eyes toward the weathered bronze medal resting above his heart. His right hand rose with deliberate care, not to protect it, not to argue, but simply to rest his fingertips against its cool surface. For the first time since entering the courtroom, something changed in his expression. It was almost invisible, no more than the faint shadow of a memory crossing an old soldier's face, carrying him somewhere far beyond polished wood, legal documents, and the echo of a judge who believed honor could be measured by appearances alone. Martin Callahan did not remove his hand from the weathered bronze medal. His fingers rested against the cool metal with remarkable gentleness, almost as though he were greeting an old friend instead of shielding an object from ridicule. The courtroom waited for him to defend himself, to protest, or perhaps to plead for understanding. Instead, he remained silent. It was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of someone who had spent an entire lifetime discovering that words often lost their value when spoken to people who had already decided what they wished to believe. Judge Richard Holloway leaned back in his chair with visible satisfaction. In his mind, the old veteran's refusal to argue only confirmed his own assumptions. Authority, he believed, belonged to the loudest voice in the room. He adjusted his black robe before glancing toward the clerk. "Make a note that the defendant refuses to verify the authenticity of these decorations," he said flatly. The scratching sound of a pen against paper echoed through the courtroom. Martin slowly lifted his eyes from the medal and looked once again toward the American flag. The faded fabric stirred almost imperceptibly beneath the steady flow of conditioned air. It reminded him that some symbols were never meant to impress strangers. They existed to remind those who carried them why sacrifice had meaning in the first place. His attorney shifted nervously beside him. "Your Honor," she began carefully, "Mr. Callahan has never claimed these medals for personal gain. They are simply part of who he is." Holloway dismissed her explanation with a careless wave of his hand. "Identity is established with evidence, counselor, not sentimental accessories." A few members of the audience lowered their eyes, uncomfortable with the direction the hearing had taken. An elderly woman sitting near the back quietly folded her hands together while a young deputy, standing near the courtroom doors, subtly tightened his jaw. No one spoke. No one interrupted. The atmosphere had become strangely heavy, as though the room itself sensed that something larger than a municipal hearing was unfolding beneath the surface. Ethan Brooks continued studying Martin with increasing curiosity. His attention no longer rested on the medals alone. It was the veteran's posture that unsettled him. There was no bitterness in the old man's face. No humiliation. No anger. Ethan had seen countless defendants stand before judges over the years. Fear always revealed itself somehow. Shaking hands, restless eyes, uneven breathing. Martin displayed none of those things. His calm seemed practiced beyond imagination. Ethan remembered visiting Arlington National Cemetery with his father as a teenager. His father had stopped beside a row of white headstones and quietly said, "The strongest soldiers I ever met never talked about proving themselves." Those words returned now with startling clarity. Judge Holloway reached toward the medals again, his fingers brushing another faded ribbon. "These old trinkets belong in a costume collection, not inside my courtroom," he remarked, his voice carrying easily through the chamber. "People cannot simply decorate themselves with history." Martin finally spoke. His voice emerged low and steady, roughened by age, yet unmistakably clear. "Those medals were never mine alone." Nothing more followed. The sentence settled over the courtroom with quiet weight. Even Judge Holloway hesitated for the briefest moment before dismissing it as meaningless sentiment. But Ethan Brooks felt something entirely different. The words did not sound rehearsed. They sounded remembered. His eyes drifted once more toward the oldest medal resting above Martin's heart. There was a tiny engraving near its edge, nearly invisible beneath decades of wear. Ethan leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. He could not read the inscription from where he sat, but something about it stirred a memory from long ago, one that refused to remain buried. Judge Richard Holloway allowed the silence to linger only long enough to convince himself that he had won. He placed the medal back against Martin Callahan's chest with little care before straightening the stack of case files on his bench. "Sentiment does not establish credibility," he said evenly. "This court is concerned with facts, not personal legends." His words echoed across the chamber, bouncing softly from polished wood and marble walls before fading into an uneasy stillness. Martin lowered his hand from the medal but did not look away from the flag standing quietly in the corner. The tiny crease at the edge of the blue field reminded him of another flag, another morning, another promise made by men who believed service was never about recognition. His breathing remained slow and measured. The years had taught him that patience often outlasted pride. Judge Holloway mistook that patience for surrender. "I have seen countless people exaggerate their past," he continued. "Uniforms, badges, medals. Every one of them expected special treatment. This courtroom does not operate on emotion." He folded his hands together with the satisfaction of someone delivering an undeniable truth. Several spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The elderly woman in the back quietly removed her glasses and looked down at her lap. Even the bailiff standing near the rail seemed reluctant to meet Martin's eyes. Ethan Brooks continued watching from the prosecution table. Something refused to settle in his mind. He had grown up around military ceremonies. His father had insisted that every ribbon, every insignia, every decoration carried rules that were never ignored by those who had earned them. Looking at Martin's chest again, Ethan noticed that nothing was displayed for appearance. The spacing was exact. The oldest medal rested slightly lower than modern regulations would normally require, a placement his father once described as an older presentation style used decades earlier. Very few people still remembered it. Ethan quietly reached beneath the table and unlocked his phone without drawing attention. He searched through a military reference archive he occasionally used during veterans-related legal cases. His eyes moved back and forth between the screen and Martin's medals. One image after another appeared, each revealing small differences. Then he paused. The worn bronze medal above Martin's heart matched an older issue almost perfectly, including the distinctive engraving pattern around its outer edge. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. Counterfeit medals almost always copied the front. Very few bothered reproducing details almost no civilian would recognize. He enlarged the photograph on his screen, comparing the faint markings to what little he could see from across the courtroom. The similarities were too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Judge Holloway continued speaking, unaware that anyone was paying attention to something other than his lecture. "Respect must be earned honestly," he declared, "not borrowed from symbols." Martin finally turned his eyes away from the flag and looked directly at the judge. There was no resentment in his expression, only quiet disappointment, as though he had heard those same words spoken by different faces across many decades. Ethan slowly lowered his phone. His father had once told him something else during a Memorial Day ceremony, words he had almost forgotten until this very moment. If you ever find yourself questioning a quiet old veteran, question your assumptions before you question his service. Ethan looked back at the weathered medals one final time, then toward the courtroom exit. Without saying a word to anyone, he quietly stood, gathered a thin folder from the prosecution table, and stepped into the hallway. The heavy wooden door closed behind him with a muted click that almost nobody inside the courtroom noticed. Martin noticed. He simply returned his gaze to the flag and waited. Martin Callahan barely noticed the quiet click of the courtroom door as Ethan Brooks disappeared into the hallway. His attention remained fixed on the worn bronze medal resting against his chest. Time seemed to slow around him until every distant sound became strangely familiar. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights faded. The shuffling papers dissolved into silence. Even the judge's voice drifted into the background like an echo carried away by the wind. Martin's fingertips gently brushed the weathered edge of the medal once more. The cool metal carried tiny imperfections that no jeweler could ever polish away. Each scratch had survived decades. Each dent had outlived the hands that once placed it there. The courtroom gradually disappeared from his thoughts, replaced by another morning beneath a wide American sky many years earlier. He was no longer an old man standing before a judge. He was a young soldier wearing a uniform that still smelled of fresh canvas and rain-soaked earth. Dawn had barely broken. A pale orange horizon stretched across distant hills while a cold breeze carried the scent of damp pine and diesel engines through the temporary command post. Around him stood exhausted soldiers whose uniforms were stained with dust and long days without rest. Nobody smiled. Nobody celebrated. They simply stood together in quiet relief that another sunrise had arrived. A senior general approached slowly across the uneven ground. His boots crunched softly over loose gravel before he stopped directly in front of Martin. There was no crowd cheering, no photographers waiting, no speeches prepared for history books. The older officer looked at the young soldier with calm eyes that reflected both pride and sorrow. In his hands rested the very bronze medal that now hung against Martin's chest. Before placing it there, the general paused for a long moment. "This belongs to every person who stood beside you," he said quietly. "You are only the one entrusted to carry it home." Martin remembered lowering his head without saying a word. The medal felt surprisingly heavy as it settled against his uniform, not because of the bronze itself, but because of the responsibility that came with wearing it. The general adjusted the ribbon carefully until it rested perfectly straight. Then he stepped back and offered a crisp salute that carried more respect than ceremony. "Never wear this for yourself," the general continued. "Wear it so the names of those who cannot stand here today are never forgotten." The memory remained as vivid as the morning it happened. Martin had honored that promise every day since. He never displayed the medal to impress strangers. He never spoke about it unless someone asked with genuine respect. Most days it stayed safely tucked away inside a simple wooden box. Today had been different. Today he had worn it because the hearing had fallen on the anniversary of that quiet ceremony, a date known only to him and a handful of families whose lives had forever become part of his own. Back inside the courtroom, the medal rested exactly where the general had placed it decades earlier. Judge Richard Holloway continued reviewing paperwork without realizing that every careless remark had been directed towards something far greater than a piece of bronze. Martin slowly opened his eyes fully, returning to the present with the same steady composure he had carried through every difficult season of his life. His hand slipped away from the metal, but the promise made beneath that distant sunrise remained exactly where it had always been, carried not on his chest alone, but deep within the quiet dignity that no courtroom could ever take from him. Outside the courtroom, Ethan Brooks moved with quiet urgency, careful not to attract attention as he stepped into the nearly empty hallway. The polished tile floor reflected the pale afternoon light spilling through the courthouse windows, while the distant ringing of telephones blended with the muffled conversations drifting from nearby offices. He stopped beside a narrow wooden bench and opened the thin folder he had carried from the courtroom. Inside were only the routine documents connected to Martin Callahan's hearing, none of which mentioned military service beyond a brief line identifying him as a retired veteran. Ethan frowned. Something about that omission felt completely wrong. He unlocked his phone once again and opened the secure legal directory that allowed government attorneys to verify federal records when necessary. Carefully entering Martin's full name, he waited as the search processed. After several seconds, the screen displayed a message that immediately caught his attention. Record archived. Additional authorization required. Ethan blinked. Ordinary military service files were rarely restricted to that degree. He tried again using the service number listed on an old Veterans Affairs document attached to the case file. This time the response appeared even faster. Contact Department of Defense Liaison Office. Verification unavailable through civilian access. Ethan slowly lowered the phone, his pulse beginning to quicken. He remembered his father's advice that unusual records almost always had an ordinary explanation, but this did not feel ordinary. Drawing a slow breath, he searched through his contacts until he found the number of an old family friend who now worked as a military legal liaison in Washington. The call connected after only 2 rings. "Michael, I need a favor," Ethan said quietly. "I am standing outside a courtroom with a veteran whose service record is completely restricted. His name is Martin Callahan." The line remained silent for a brief moment. Then Michael's calm voice changed. "Did you say Martin Callahan?" Ethan looked down the empty hallway. "Yes." Another pause followed, noticeably longer this time. "Do not speculate," Michael replied carefully. "Give me exactly 5 minutes. Do not leave the courthouse." Before Ethan could ask another question, the call ended. He stared at the blank screen, surprised by the sudden urgency. Inside the courtroom, Judge Richard Holloway continued organizing documents with growing impatience. "It appears we have lost one of our attorneys," he remarked dryly, glancing toward the closed door. "Hopefully he has not wandered off searching for more fictional evidence." A few restrained laughs echoed through the gallery, though they faded much faster than before. The atmosphere had changed. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was slowly giving way to uncertainty. Martin Callahan remained exactly where he had been from the beginning. His hands rested comfortably in front of him, his breathing steady, his expression unchanged. He did not ask where Ethan had gone. He did not seem surprised that someone had finally started asking questions. The elderly woman seated near the back studied him quietly before whispering to the man beside her. "He looks like someone who has already lived through much harder days than this." The man gave a silent nod. Several minutes later, Ethan's phone vibrated sharply. A message flashed across the screen before he even answered the returning call. "Priority verification initiated. Please remain available." He accepted the call immediately. Michael spoke in a lower voice than before. "Listen carefully. Someone very senior has already been notified that Martin Callahan's name surfaced during a civilian verification request. I cannot explain everything over the phone, but I strongly recommend you return to that courtroom and make sure nobody asks him to remove those medals. Someone is already on the way." Ethan Brooks slipped back into the courtroom just as Judge Richard Holloway reached for the next document on his bench. The heavy wooden door closed quietly behind him. But the urgency in Ethan's face contrasted sharply with the calm professionalism he normally carried. He returned to the prosecution table without speaking, carefully placing his folder down while keeping one hand on his phone beneath the polished surface. The message from Washington remained open on the screen, its short words refusing to leave his thoughts. "Priority verification initiated. Someone is already on the way. Judge Holloway barely acknowledged Ethan's return. I trust your brief absence has concluded, he said with unmistakable irritation. We have wasted enough time already. Ethan nodded politely, but offered no explanation. His attention remained fixed on Martin Callahan, whose quiet composure had not changed by even the smallest degree. The old veteran stood exactly where he had been since the hearing began, neither defensive nor impatient. It occurred to Ethan that Martin behaved less like a defendant waiting for judgment and more like a soldier who understood that some outcomes arrived only after patience had been exhausted. Several spectators noticed Ethan's unusual silence. The elderly woman in the gallery exchanged another glance with the deputy standing near the entrance. Neither could explain why the atmosphere had shifted so dramatically, but everyone could feel it. The room no longer carried the confidence of an ordinary courtroom proceeding. Instead, an invisible tension settled over every seat, every desk, every polished wooden rail. Judge Holloway picked up his reading glasses and adjusted the paperwork once more. Since there appears to be no credible evidence supporting these declarations, he announced, this court is prepared to proceed accordingly. Before he could continue, Ethan slowly rose to his feet. Your Honor, he said respectfully, I would ask the court for a brief postponement. Holloway frowned immediately. On what grounds? Ethan chose every word carefully. Additional verification is currently being conducted through official federal channels. A faint smile crossed the judge's face. Federal channels? He repeated with open skepticism. Counselor, this hearing concerns municipal code enforcement, not national security. A few restrained chuckles surfaced again, but this time they sounded uncertain. Ethan remained calm. I understand, Your Honor. Nevertheless, I strongly recommend allowing that verification to conclude before any final decision is made. Holloway folded his arms. And exactly how long would this mysterious verification require? Ethan glanced briefly at the phone resting beside his folder. I do not know. The answer only deepened the judge's frustration. Then this court will not delay itself indefinitely over speculation. He reached for his gavel while the clerk prepared to record the next order. At that exact moment, Ethan's phone vibrated once more. He lowered his eyes for only a second before reading the newest message. Verification confirmed. Senior Military Command notified. Estimated arrival 12 minutes. Ethan inhaled slowly. His heartbeat remained steady, but the significance of those words settled heavily in his mind. Senior Military Command did not respond to ordinary veterans. It responded only when something carried extraordinary importance. He quietly locked the screen without revealing its contents. Across the room, Martin noticed the subtle movement, but showed no surprise. His calm expression remained unchanged, as though he had already recognized the direction events were taking long before anyone else. Outside the courthouse, far beyond the hearing room's thick stone walls, the distant sound of approaching vehicle engines gradually blended with the afternoon traffic, unnoticed by everyone inside except fate itself, which had begun moving toward the courthouse one deliberate mile at a time. SUA, the second hand on the courtroom clock, seemed unusually loud as it swept across another minute. Every quiet tick settled into the room like a reminder that something unseen was drawing closer. Judge Richard Holloway glanced impatiently toward the windows before returning his attention to the papers spread across his bench. The court has waited long enough, he declared, his voice firm once again. Speculation is not evidence, and delayed proceedings serve no one. The clerk adjusted her glasses and prepared to continue recording the hearing while the bailiff shifted his weight near the courtroom entrance. Ethan Brooks remained standing. His phone rested silently inside his jacket pocket, but he could almost feel the weight of the latest message against his chest. 12 minutes had become 8. 8 had quietly become 6. He understood only one thing with certainty. Whatever was coming had already left Washington before anyone inside this courthouse realized they were part of something far larger than a routine municipal hearing. Martin Callahan stood with the same quiet composure that had unsettled Ethan from the very beginning. His gaze drifted briefly toward the courtroom doors before returning to the American flag. There was no anticipation in his face, no trace of nervous expectation. It was almost as though he had accepted every possible outcome long before walking through the courthouse entrance that morning. Judge Holloway looked directly at him. Mr. Callahan, he said, This is your final opportunity to provide credible documentation regarding those decorations before this court reaches its conclusion. Martin answered without hesitation. The documentation already exists. Holloway raised an eyebrow. Then where is it? Martin's expression never changed. With the people who entrusted them to me. The response drew puzzled expressions throughout the gallery. Judge Holloway exhaled sharply through his nose. That is not an answer recognized by any court. He reached toward the stack of prepared orders resting beside his gavel. Ethan felt the room tighten around that single movement. Before another word could be spoken, a faint vibration rolled through the polished wooden floor beneath everyone's feet. It was subtle enough that most people ignored it, assuming a delivery truck had passed outside. Seconds later, another sound followed. Vehicle doors closing. More than one. The deputy standing nearest the courthouse entrance instinctively turned his head toward the hallway. Through the thick walls came the distant rhythm of measured footsteps, calm, organized, and unmistakably disciplined. The elderly woman seated in the back slowly lifted her eyes toward the courtroom doors. The clerk stopped writing for a brief moment without realizing she had done so. Judge Holloway frowned. "Can someone determine what that disturbance is?" he asked. The bailiff nodded and stepped into the hallway. Less than 20 seconds passed before he returned. His face had lost all of its earlier confidence. He leaned toward the clerk and whispered something too quietly for the gallery to hear. Whatever he said caused the clerk's eyes to widen before she immediately looked toward the judge. Holloway frowned even more deeply. "Speak clearly," he ordered. The bailiff swallowed once before answering. "Your Honor, there is a military delegation requesting immediate access to the courtroom." A ripple of confusion spread through the spectators. Ethan slowly closed his eyes for a single breath. Right on time. Judge Holloway straightened his robe and forced a restrained smile. "Tell them they will have to wait until these proceedings have concluded." The bailiff hesitated. "Sir, I already tried." Holloway's expression hardened. "And?" The bailiff looked briefly toward the closed courtroom doors before answering in a quieter voice than anyone had heard from him all morning. "They said they were not here to observe the hearing. They said they were here because of Mr. Martin Callahan, ... The courtroom fell into a silence so complete that even the steady hum of the overhead lights seemed to disappear. Judge Richard Holloway remained seated for a brief moment. His expression caught somewhere between irritation and disbelief. He looked toward the closed doors as though expecting the interruption to resolve itself. It did not. 3 measured knocks echoed through the heavy oak panels. Before anyone inside could respond, the doors opened slowly. 2 uniformed military aides entered first, their movements precise and restrained. They stepped aside without speaking, creating a clear path down the center aisle. Behind them walked General Thomas Whitaker. His dress uniform carried 4 silver stars that reflected beneath the courtroom lights with quiet authority. Every ribbon, every insignia, every polished button spoke of decades devoted to service, yet nothing about his presence suggested arrogance. He moved with calm confidence, the kind earned only through responsibility rather than rank alone. The deputy nearest the entrance instinctively straightened his posture. The bailiff quietly stepped aside without being asked. Conversations that had lingered in whispers vanished completely. Judge Holloway quickly rose to his feet. "General," he began, forcing a courteous smile, "this proceeding is currently in session. If you would simply allow us a few more minutes." General Whitaker acknowledged him with a brief glance before continuing forward. He offered no interruption and no criticism. His attention remained fixed on one person alone. Martin Callahan. The elderly veteran slowly turned toward the approaching officer. For the first time that morning, the faintest trace of recognition appeared in his eyes. It was not surprise. It was the quiet familiarity shared by people who understood the same unspoken promises. General Whitaker stopped directly in front of him. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. The entire courtroom watched, waiting for someone to explain what was happening. Instead, the general carefully reached toward the weathered bronze medal resting against Martin's chest. His hands moved with extraordinary care as he gently straightened the slightly twisted ribbon that had been disturbed earlier during the hearing. He brushed away an almost invisible fold in the fabric before ensuring the medal rested perfectly level. Only after finishing that small gesture did he take one slow step backward. Then, without hesitation, General Whitaker raised his right hand in a flawless military salute. It was crisp, deliberate, absolute. The movement carried no performance and no hesitation. It was an act of profound respect offered from one soldier to another. The effect inside the courtroom was immediate. Both military aides snapped to attention and returned the salute. The deputy, standing near the entrance, instinctively followed. The bailiff, though never having served himself, removed his hand from his duty belt and stood perfectly still. Even Ethan Brooks found himself rising straighter without consciously deciding to do so. Judge Holloway remained frozen beside the bench, his carefully rehearsed authority suddenly feeling painfully small against the quiet dignity unfolding before him. General Whitaker lowered his salute only after several respectful seconds had passed. His voice, when he finally spoke, remained calm enough that everyone in the courtroom leaned forward to hear it. "Mr. Callahan," he said warmly, "please accept my apology that it took us this long to arrive." Martin offered the smallest nod. "You came," he answered softly. "That is enough." The general allowed himself a faint smile before turning slowly toward the bench. The warmth disappeared from his expression, replaced not by anger, but by unwavering professional resolve. Every eye in the courtroom shifted with him. Without raising his voice, without making a single dramatic gesture, he looked directly at Judge Richard Holloway and said, "Your Honor, before this court proceeds another moment, there are facts regarding Mr. Martin Callahan that you deserve to hear." General Thomas Whitaker turned toward Judge Richard Holloway with the calm confidence of a man who had delivered difficult truths throughout his entire career. No anger crossed his face. No raised voice disturbed the silence that had settled over the courtroom. He simply reached into a leather portfolio carried by one of his aides and removed a single cream-colored folder bearing the seal of the Department of Defense. He placed it gently on the clerk's desk instead of handing it directly to the judge. "These are the official service records of Mr. Martin Callahan," he said evenly. "They have remained under restricted protection for many decades because portions of his service involved operations that were only fully declassified recently. His decorations have been verified by the Department of Defense, the Department of the Army, and the Office of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff." The courtroom remained perfectly still. Judge Holloway stared at the folder without touching it. The confidence that had carried him through the morning quietly disappeared behind an expression of disbelief. General Whitaker continued, "The bronze medal that has received so much attention today was presented personally with the instruction that it represented not only one soldier, but every member of a unit whose courage prevented a far greater tragedy. Mr. Callahan accepted that responsibility and has carried it with extraordinary humility ever since." Ethan Brooks lowered his eyes for a moment, remembering every instinct that had told him something was wrong. The elderly woman in the gallery quietly wiped away a tear before folding her hands together once again. Even the clerk looked at Martin differently now, no longer seeing an aging defendant, but a man who had silently carried history into the courtroom. Judge Holloway finally found his voice. "Mr. Callahan," he said quietly, "it appears this court reached conclusions before understanding the facts." Martin looked at him with the same calm expression he had worn since the hearing began. "We all see only part of another person's story," he answered softly. "Sometimes that is enough to make us certain. It rarely makes us correct." The words carried no accusation. They carried only wisdom earned through years that could never be measured inside legal documents or military archives. General Whitaker stepped beside Martin once more. "If you are willing," he said respectfully, "there are several young officers waiting outside who asked whether they might have the honor of meeting you." Martin smiled for the first time that day. It was a small smile, gentle and almost shy. "If they came to listen instead of celebrate," he replied, "I would be glad to shake their hands." General Whitaker returned the smile with quiet appreciation. Together they walked toward the courtroom doors at an unhurried pace. As Martin passed the American flag, he paused for only a moment, resting his fingertips lightly against the weathered bronze medal before continuing forward. One by one, every person in the courtroom rose to their feet. No one instructed them to stand. No announcement was made. Respect spread through the room naturally, passing from one person to another until even Judge Richard Holloway stood silently behind the bench. No applause broke the moment. None was needed. The Doors closed softly behind Martin and the general, leaving only a quiet courtroom and a lesson that lingered long after they were gone. Some honors shine because they are made of metal. The greatest ones endure because they are carried with humility, remembered with gratitude, and never worn for recognition, but for those whose names still deserve to be spoken with respect.